you.
That's when you hear out of no.
Well, you're just, I cover my mic. I've always wanted to. Jim told me to make sure you could turn your microphone on.
Okay, thank you. All right. Ready? Okay. The Community and Technical College Formula Advisory Meeting is called to order. I am Dr. Pamela Anglin from Paris Junior College, and I'm serving as chair. Please be advised that this meeting is being broadcast over the internet and recorded, so I would ask all attendees to silence your cell phones. For those attending via teleconference, please mute your phone until you are ready to speak. This prevents background noise. Thank you. Mr. Gilmore, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Terry Crawford,
Present.
Mr. Cesar Maldonado, Dr. Brent Wallace,
Present.
Mr. Patrick Lee,
Here.
Mr. Richard Cervantes. Are you on the call?
Present.
Excellent. Ms. Mary Wicklund,
Present.
Mr. Jim Yiannopoulos,
Present.
Mr. Michael Reeser.
I'm here.
Great. Dr. Robert Riza,
Here.
Dr. Pamela Anglin,
Here.
Dr. Phil Rhodes,
Here.
Dr. Jeremy McMillan,
Here.
Ms. Mary Elizondo. Are you?
Present.
Great. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
A quorum is present. As a reminder, members on the call are permitted to vote. We'll begin with item 2, which is consideration and approval of the minutes from the November 6, 2019 meeting. The draft minutes were included in the meeting materials. Do members have comments, questions, or corrections to the draft minutes?
I'll make a motion, we accept the minutes as presented.
Second.
Second.
Okay. We have a motion by Jim Yiannopoulos, a second by Robert Riza. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those
Aye.
opposed, same sign. Okay, thank you. We'll move to item number 3, which is discussion, review, and consideration of the Commissioner's 2020-21 biennium charges. We'll begin with charge 1, which is to study and make recommendations for the appropriate funding levels for the core, contact hour, and student success funding. We were to review the draft for the community college funding recommendation provided in the meeting materials relating to charge 1, which is to set funding level rates. And I will go through the subcommittee recommendation for community colleges. Core operations moving to $2 million per community college district would increase our appropriations by a total of $32 million. Success points moving to $215 per success point, and we had used the success points that would be generated based on the recommendation that will come from the committee looking at the success point metrics. And right now we have $271.8 million, which would be a $43.5 million increase. And I understand that some recalculations on that, on the academically and economically disadvantaged, would be about $320,000 less. So that number would be adjusted before we turned in our final report. But based on $215 per success point, and based on the metrics as proposed in charge 2? 3. Okay. And then contact hours is going to $5.57 per contact hour. So that would go to $1,578.5 million, or a $44.8 million increase. And then the Bachelor of Applied Technology would end up with a $0.6 million increase. So the total change right now, with the numbers that we have, $120.9 million, or a 6.6% increase from the current appropriations. So any further discussion?
Dr. England, I just wanted to, in visiting with my administration, just looking at the core operations and things and reviewing the list, but just one of the things that is in here, but just wanted to mention is, I know at Clarendon when we went to when we revamped our developmental ed in 2014, and we went to the co-rec model, just went to it. We didn't know what it was, we just did it. Just in tuition and fees cost Clarendon College between $250,000 and $300,000 a year. That, and I told them, we'll be successful, but we're going to eat some money. So just this helps offset that. But that just for us being that small, I can only imagine what, as it continues to grow, what some of the other colleges and schools are going to feel. But, I mean, we ran the numbers for Chairman Seliger last session, and it was over somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000 a year in tuition and fees, because they weren't staying in developmental ed. But we wanted to, I told them I would say that, so.
And I did send an email out to all 50 community college presidents asking for input on this. So far, I've only heard from 6.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. England, how do you envision that affecting these numbers? When all 50 if all 50 colleges were to respond and give you a dollar figures for all these unfunded mandates that, the senior universities, I had this discussion with senior universities and some other folks that, their ask covers all of those kinds of things where ours doesn't. And so it affects us more. So going forward, if we were to come in, let's say that totaled $200 million that isn't covered. The state imposed that on us for the most part. So how do we adjust? What is our tactic, you think, for making adjustments?
As I've started working on this and even getting a list to put together to then go back to business officers and say put dollar amounts on it, it's not going to be an easy task, and it's going to take a little bit of time, which is going to be a time frame outside of what the Formula Advisory Committee has to work on. So I think what we're doing, I think it's good for us to get those numbers gathered together so that we have them to answer legislators' questions. And so that's kind of where as a committee, we need to move forward. But I think our work on this, it is just like Robert just said, and him having the cost of what co-requisites have cost them. As we all start putting numbers together, it's going to be some really valuable data to have for legislators when they ask questions.
Yeah, and to go along with your email that you sent out, the request, I was in contact with a couple of our colleagues, and they didn't realize they were supposed to put dollar figures to that. They looked at your list and thought, oh, yeah, well, this is the list. We'll just go with it. It looks good. So
Right.
I said, no, you need to give her dollar figures to go with those.
Well, we were going to go to the presidents to get items and then put the item list together and then go back to business officers for dollars. So
Okay.
that,
Thank you.
any additional discussion?
Pam, I have something, but I wanted to make sure no one else had anything before I went into that.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, kind of to Jim's point, and really to the work of this group, I think this week was the first time we had seen the total package put together because of the work of the metrics task force and the work around success points. And that dollar figure was the outlier that we're waiting on. And so this is really new information, and it led to a 6.6% increase. And so I would encourage us to think around what other ways can we think about cost and trends increase in cost, and can we work with data maybe that the coordinating board has to make sure that this 6.6% is in line with that. If it's not in line with that, is there something we would perhaps like to see come back in January? One proposal could be that if it's not in line with that, maybe the additional dollars could go into contact hours as a marker or a holding place for that conversation to carry on. It seems like we've done a lot of work this time that we hadn't necessarily done in the past, and I appreciate the work that we've done and that we've gotten to this place. But I think pondering what that real cost increase trend is and being able to really articulate that well to our friends in the legislature would be beneficial to us. And then I can't not be in this meeting and not say the following, which I've said every time. We have a 60 by 30 Texas goal, right, or goals. How did our methodology for arriving at these dollars align with what our targets are for those goals, and in what particular ways did that occur? And we have talked for many years about trying to develop a plan that says here's the community college's piece of 60 by 30, here's what the cost of doing that would be in our best estimate, and then funding that. And then if we don't fund that, we shouldn't be surprised that we didn't get to our goal. And so that work also is, I think we can make it a proxy for cost increase, but I think the goal of tying 60 by 30 to those goals into more specific measures is a little more lengthy process than this committee has time for. So I would encourage, I'm glad to be at this place, and I would encourage some flexibility to look at that idea of, do we have a barometer for those costs that we've seen over time? Because they didn't just start last week,
No,
you know.
they didn't.
So that's my thought and contribution.
Hey, may I ask, make a comment? Dr. McMillan, you know, I'm glad you mentioned the 60 by 30 because that is a concern. You know, one thing left out of the 60 by 30 is employment. There's nothing, it's all about credentials, you know. And I surmise that really what we need to be doing is probably working closer with TWC to assess which programs lead from and easily to employment through us and through the university. So I think if we could somehow target that and figure that out, that would lay out the cost for those kinds of things. But again, that's probably bigger than our committee here, but.
We can also, as we have more data now, and as Jeremy's group continues to look at it, do we vote on final recommendations today, or do we come back in January as we have more data and final
Dr. Angel?
the total ask?
Brent?
Yeah. I don't know that the other conversation leads us not to go ahead and move forward with this work. I agree with Jeremy in the sense that those are conversations we need to have later on with the coordinating board and input and further data. So if you were entertaining a motion, I would go ahead and make a motion for us to move forward with this plan.
Okay.
I'd second that
Okay.
motion.
All right. So we have a motion by Dr. Wallace, second by Jim Yiannopoulos. We have further discussion. Jeremy, do you have?
I do, and the only thing I would entertain is if those dialogues with the coordinating board staff led us to find out that, I don't know, that we could barometer that additional cost at 8% as opposed to 6.6%, I would entertain perhaps a friendly amendment to the motion that you empower the chair to work with that for our final recommendation. by the time we convene next month. That, of course, can die for lack of a acceptance.
And in your amendment, is that in contact hour funding?
It would be. yeah.
Okay. So we have a second to the amendment? Dr. Wallace?
Dr. Wallace, I would second the amendment. That's perfect.
Okay, all right. So we have an amendment to the motion. So our motion, let me just make sure we're clear on it, that pending the data on our cost increases, if it were more, then we adjust the contact hour funding prior to submitting our final report. Increase it. So all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? We'll move to charge 3, which is study and make recommendations on the efficacy of critical need fields as they relate to contact hour and success point funding. We were to review the draft recommendation provided in the meeting materials relating to charge 3, which is to recommend changes in critical need fields as it relates to contact hour and success point funding. Dr. McMillan, do you have any additional comments?
So I would make comments around critical fields and success point funding and reiterate that we would ask for critical fields for success points be renamed as targeted fields, and that we recommend a standard procedure by which we update targeted fields, and that procedure allows us to refresh that, to add new items to the targeted fields list every 2 years in conjunction with or in advance of this group's operations. And that further, because once a field is introduced, that a field must remain on the critical fields list for at least, it must, if it's coming off the list, it must not appear on the list for 2 consecutive biennia for it to come off of the list. So that allows institutions to build those programs and know that they would receive those success points for that. The methodology is identified in the packet, and you're familiar with that in terms of largest growth and targeted occupations by the state, and then also some tie to the median state income wages for that. This recommendation and the data in this piece adds new fields to the targeted list based upon that methodology. Those zip codes are identified in the packet. It does not remove any existing fields for this immediate biennium. And so that's an important piece to look at, and Jim actually does get a little bit to what you were talking about in terms of employment, because these are, you know, what is the workforce demanding against what are we producing collectively, you know, as a state. We just really feel like it's important to have that process be something that the legislature adopts, and a work group of TAC and the coordinating board come together on an every 2-year basis. And that would be the recommendation. And that piece about the 2-year basis and that's not in the narrative. And so I'd like to make sure that you have an opportunity to give feedback on that piece of it.
When you go back through, you said if it comes off the list, it can't go back on?
So if a critical field or targeted field does not appear on the list, let's say it doesn't appear next session on the list, let's say it shows up for the first time this session on the list.
And if I could just clarify, on the list is looking at data, statewide data, that list is the top critical fields in Texas. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
yeah. So it's top 20 top largest growing fields that lead to certificates or associate degrees, top 20 fastest growing in those same credentials, or a targeted occupation by the Workforce Commission, or at least 11 workforce boards. It has to meet 2 of those criteria: fastest or largest growing or targeted occupation. And if it does that, then what are the wages? And if it's below the state wage, that work group I'm talking about would have some active dialogue about whether it should be on the list or not. If you know, we've got to make sure we're putting out credentials that lead to livable wages and/or build the capacity of the state. And so, Julie, I see you're wanting to make a comment.
No, I just wanted to say we're on page 11, where it's laid out in the materials we were provided for the meeting.
So to your question, Robert, if a field is added this year and then college begins a program and the field came off next session, the field wouldn't come off the list next session. It would have to not appear on the list the following session before it would then follow off. The notion being you don't want to start a program and by the time you have graduates, it's off the list. We felt like building some parameters in there for that would be important. Is that clear enough for folks? Okay. So I have other things under the you want me to go forward with that or?
Still on
overall?
charge 3?
I do, yeah. So under charge 3, we also have critical fields and contact hour reimbursement. As you look at that, critical fields for this purpose is tied to a course, not a program. And it is one of those that at this point, the recommendation is to not make any changes, but to begin further study around what is the relationship between the updated process we're using for critical or for targeted fields for success points and this, and hopefully that study would occur within the course of the next year. And so the idea by this time, next committee meeting, we have perhaps a recommendation around what that process is for getting things on that list.
Any additional discussion? Anything from those of you that are on the phone? Okay. Do I hear a motion to approve the recommendation?
I'll make a motion. Go ahead, Robert, you make the motion.
So moved.
I'll second.
Okay. Robert Riza has made the motion, and Jim Yiannopoulos has seconded.
Sure, absolutely. I wrote it down.
Okay. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Anyone opposed, same sign? Okay. Thank you. Then we'll move on to charge 4. We were to review the draft recommendation provided in the meeting materials relating to charge 4, which is to recommend the appropriate number of points to be awarded for each success point metric. Dr. McMillan?
So for reference, we're on page 13 of the draft document. The current draft includes a $43.5 million increase to success point funding overall. $14.5 million of that is due to the recommendation to have success points equal $215 per point and updating targeted fields as we just discussed. The $17.5 million is due to an anticipated growth in success points before we add new points in of 7.5%. And finally, there were updates to the success point metrics themselves that related to academically and economically disadvantaged in the areas of credentials awarded and transfer, and that equated to $11.3 million. We have a table that summarizes that for you, and you can see where those aggregate dollars fall. And so that is in the middle of page 13, and so for each column there, you see where those dollars come in, and that final recommended amount is $271 million. As you scroll down, you see the change in percentage of funding by success point type. What I'm sharing there for you is that by doing this and adding the additional success points for academic and economically disadvantaged, we are seeing a shift towards more of the dollars allocated to success points going to credentials and transfer. And then if you go to page 15, this is a recap of something we had shared in the prior meetings, but this is the current value of points per, current value of points, the proposed rider that is in the legislative bill pattern, and then the proposal that is emerging out of this committee. And you see the changes that are recommended or highlighted in either green or blue. The very first one of those is that if a student that completes 15 hours of credit, if all of those hours are dual credit, we would add a quarter of a point to that. Under credentials awarded, the recommendation is to remain at 2 points. The rider would have had that go to 1.2, but we would recommend leaving that at 2 and adding a quarter point for both academically and economically disadvantaged, leaving targeted fields at 2.25 points as opposed to going to 3 points essentially, and that would be that's the quarter point for the targeted field amount, and then also leaving academically and economically disadvantaged in that. And then when you go to transfer, there are two components of transfer: the transfer of 15 hours and now the transfer of 15 hours when you're in a co-enrollment program, and both of those would lead to remaining at 2.0 as opposed to increasing to 2.75, but adding a quarter point for each, academic and economically disadvantaged. And so this is paying attention to the legislative desire to award more weight in credentials and transfer, but doing that in a way that aligns with the equity issues that we are working on at all of our colleges across the state. I do want to comment briefly, and then be probably corrected by Julie, about the economically disadvantaged. I'm going to try to get this right this time, Julie. So you're right at the ready to keep me on target. So economically disadvantaged currently is students that received Pell. Did I do that right? Yeah. The very first time in months. So it's students who receive Pell. The data you have before you also includes students that we're trying to get in by other measures. When you heard the chair share earlier that there would be a $320,000 decrease, we wanted to go forward with the recommendation with what we knew we could use in the data, and that's why that decrease is there. We would like the committee to embrace the idea of economically disadvantaged. Right now, that means Pell received, but there are some other potential ways to look at that by gathering information around free and reduced lunch or EFC from, and those permissions would be from TEA or the U.S. Department of Education. But we thought it was most appropriate, again, as time marches on, to pull back the recommendation to what we knew we could have in terms of the data, and that would lead to a slight decrease in those dollars. So, Julie, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think you did an excellent job. The only thing I will add is I've done some quick math, and if you go back to page 9 where we have the overall recommendation, it still leaves us at 6.6%, dropping off that 300,000. I think we dropped down to about 18.9% on the percent change on success points. So overall, it is quite a small change, and we'll go ahead if this is adopted and make those changes to the report and share the data by institution.
And I think it's good to make clear our recommendation is to empower the coordinating board to capture that information in whatever way they could to accurately reflect our students' economic challenges and reward institutions that help them overcome those issues. So.
Yes, thank you.
The next page, page 16, has, instead of aggregated how those dollars fall into the various buckets, how the dollars fall into each success point metric itself. Developmental ed math, here's the dollar figure that comes from that, and so on. And so I tried to lay out where these impacts really are. That $320,000, you mentioned it's a small decrease overall. I think we calculated earlier it's economically disadvantaged bonus across all the metrics was about $6.2 million, and so to reduce that by this $320,000 is not a substantial even into that. So following that is just a recap. We were charged with reviewing the efficacy of all points, and this is just a restatement in the language the coordinating board uses to define those and those recommendations on points there. And so that is a recommendation coming from the subcommittee and also the TAC Metrics Task Force. I will make a comment that there was some discussion about, is a quarter point enough? And would it be more appropriate to go to a half a point? And it might be good to have some discussion here. I will say that the TAC Metrics Task Force this morning, as we visited, had no strong appetite for staying or going. The only notion being that if you did an additional a quarter point for each of those, that we get more skin in the game and it may have more influence over future behaviors. So I'd like to hear any conversation from the group and ultimately lead to a recommendation that we move forward with.
Your thoughts?
So, Jeremy, just a quick question on, and I'm looking at page 15,
Okay.
just because that's an easy one for us to look at. What were the thoughts behind the 0.25 point as it relates specifically to dual credit first 15 hours? Was the thought of the task force that there is such an additional expense associated with dual credit that would help offset institutional expense? Is that kind of where we came from the dual credit standpoint?
That is a culmination of feedback at the president's meeting where this was laid out, and we heard many comments around dual credit. Additionally, if you look at some of the things we're doing with credentials awarded and transfer, some of the dual credit students that we have do not wind up graduating with us. So we know that some of our students in dual credit are academically and economically disadvantaged, and so we really wouldn't have any way of reflecting that. And so it's a combination of all of those things and those notions. And there's just a strong desire to think in terms of that. Further, why all 15 hours of the first 15 hours? Well, we know that from our data, dual credit seems to have a really powerful impact, and we thought this might encourage students to and institutions to deepen that commitment to get students to that 15 hours of credit. And others that were in the meetings or on the subcommittee, please share.
So this is Terry Crawford. I think some of the conversation around that, Brent, also stemmed from a desire to figure out funding for dual credit, given all the different, it is on. So it was really trying to address some of the funding issues with it and the variety of revenue models implemented by colleges. That was part of that conversation as well.
And the other comment I would make is really that's $2 million in nearly a $2 billion funding for community colleges, and so proportionally it's not a substantial investment. This is something that we just wanted to recognize. And so
A question.
And so,
Brent, are you leading to why isn't it lower?
yeah, that's probably a better way for me to put this. Jeremy, you mentioned specifically, are we wanting to look at any of these at 0.5 versus the 0.25? Of all of those, when I look at the expenses we have and the associated expense and what we're trying to cover and where our money is most, where we lose, honestly, a lot, is in that dual credit. And the 0.5 there makes a lot of sense to me. That doesn't mean I wouldn't be supportive of this. And I think that's where we work again with the coordinating board to really make sure that as we study this over the next few, what is dual credit, getting more data on dual credit as far as is that covering what we all have institutional, because my institutional costs are associated more with that in my instance than it would be even the other pieces that we're trying to serve of the new recommendation. Does that make sense?
So it does, and I want to speak to this, and I reserve the right to be wrong about the data, but I think we looked at 12 hours and 15 hours.
We did.
And there was very little difference in terms of our students. If they're getting 12 hours most of the time, they are getting 15 hours. And Julie, can you help me with that.
We did see, looking over time, that it was higher at 12, and you did see a drop, but that drop was decreasing, and I think it tended to be higher because of the old rules that allowed students, just as juniors and seniors, to take 2 courses a semester, so 12 was a common number. But if you look at the more recent data, we see those coming closer together, and I think the discussion around the fact that now at 15 hours, there's a degree plan required, and 15 hours is a semester, and it's what we've always tracked in terms of that first milestone for successfully completing coursework. I believe that was all part of the discussion around the 15 hours.
And you recall earlier discussions on this was perhaps we reduced the momentum point here to 12 hours for all, but just being that value of being consistent at 15 just seemed to resonate as well. But however, your point about do you double that to half a point is maybe something worthy of some thought.
I'll just piggybacking on what Dr. Wallace said, when you look at, and I'm not knocking any of it, but if we were going, if there's going to be a fight, is that where the fight needs to be? Because in going back to the earlier conversations about core operations, if I were to go back and move all my dual credit to regular rack rates, now my dual credit's going to fall off significantly, but, as we've discounted it and, the conversations in this room regarding that. I mean, it's a little bit to help, but, I mean, what's the, I'm working off of a computer, which means I can't figure out what, doubling that would be. How much additional money, funds are we looking at if we went from 0.25 to 0.5?
So in this case, it would be another $2.1 million. And so.
A couple million here, a couple million there. Eventually, we'll get to some real funds.
Yeah, I had pushed for the 12 hours because I have a preponderance of our students who are on Pell and who are on VA, and 12 hours is full-time, so. But I agree that you can't get to that degree in 2 years if you're doing 12 hours at a time. So I acquiesce to the 15 hours, which I think is fine. I would go along with the discussion to increase it to 0.5 points, but
So do we have a motion to approve the recommendations with that change, or approve the recommendations as they stand?
You want to hear it? So not hearing a rush to the microphone, another alternative would be approve it as written with the notion that we have between now and January to have further discussions with other colleagues of ours, and perhaps that we come back at that point or that you empower the chair to bring that back, and that could be an alternative to that. And so I guess since no one else made a recommendation, I will move that we do that, and then further discussion can ensue.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, we have a motion by Jeremy and a second by Jim to accept this proposal as presented today and allow the chair some flexibility as additional discussion takes place to bring it back to the full committee in January. Yeah. Any further discussion before I call for a vote? All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay. All right, let me make a couple of notes here. So
This is recorded.
yeah.
Getting writer's craft.
Okay. Okay, and then we'll move to item 5 on the agenda.
May I ask a question really quick?
Sure.
So Jeremy, were you asking about the academic and economic disadvantaged? I know the conversation in our last meeting was around that, not so much dual credit. Was that the question, or do we just let it go now?
So I assume that the motion as accepted as written, there was seemed like strong conversation around the dual credit at half of a point. I think it would be valuable to know if this group, it seemed like there was a preference to that over moving the others, but if there is a desire of this group to think about the others as a half a point, that would be valuable to know. But right now, I'm assuming everything's at a quarter, with the dual credit being the one that has the most look. So I would like to know if there is a desire for the other, or what the committee's thoughts are. I want to make sure that people knew that they did that.
Okay, our vote was a desire to potentially increase the dual credit to 0.5. So is there any discussion on the academically disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged being relooked at? Okay, so hear none. All right. Then our next meeting is scheduled for January 9th at 1:00 p.m. if needed. And the potential of doing it as just a conference call, that sound?
Yeah, I
Okay.
believe it will be needed based on this meeting, so it's just a
Yeah.
decision on whether it's in person or a
Okay.
conference call.
So do you want it in person or conference call?
I leave that to the
It's on
discretion of the chair.
I think PAC has some meetings that morning, so I think either.
Yeah, I think we can do, a number of us will be in Austin anyway, so we can do a face-to-face and then
Just like we're doing
just
Anyone
like
who
we
wants to
are
call in.
today. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Then, if there are no further questions or points of discussion, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Robert Riza, and
Second.
second by Jim. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Just want to say a huge thank you to Roland and Julie for all of the data that's run into to Jeremy for all of the work of the metrics group in looking at everything. And Chris, we've had more data this year to look at than I think we've ever had, and it's been a really good experience and opportunity to really see what we're working with. So thank you all very much.
I would echo that. Just outstanding work and being responsive to many requests that maybe didn't make the light of day to this committee, but a lot of thoughts have gone into that by many of you, but the work on the workhorse side. And I know there are other folks here that deserve that recognition that are not in the room, and I just appreciate them greatly.
Yes, we will make sure to let them know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are adjourned.